Okay, Sarah Broderick is an MFA candidate of creative writing fiction at San Francisco State University. Last May, she graduated from New York University's John W. Draper Interdisciplinary Master's Program, where she focused on narratives of Americanness. She has worked in the documentary and commercial film industries and as a researcher, instructor, and tutor. While she has yet to publish her creative writing, her academic work appeared in the fall 2011 issue of Novus. She lives in Mill Valley with her husband and their pet chinchilla, Elvis. Please welcome Sarah.
Thanks everybody for coming. Thank you, Belro, again for having me. This is an excerpt from a long short story. I hope you enjoy. Like an avalanche. She tried not to jump when the gun went off. From inside the truck cab, Hannah Jean could see out through the trees of the orchard, beyond the vegetable garden to the house, listen to the radio, and pretend not to think about what was at her back. Even though she knew it was coming, still it landed as a surprise. Bang. No crows or birds of any kind flew up with the sound like always happened in the movies, so she pressed her feet back and forth in the air above the pedals, a good inch or two from the gas and brake, and gripped the leather of the steering wheel, imitated a car chase instead. "You can come on out," said Grandpa Jack. He had got her attention by tapping the head of the shovel against the truck's metal frame. Tap, tap. Hannah Jean locked the wheel up before pulling the keys from the ignition and hopping out. The place seemed different now, quiet, humid, and heavy, and so did the ground, which molded to her feet, sucked her down just a bit as she rounded the truck. But she knew that was silly. She wanted to help. The body had been folded nice and neat in a tattered, checkered tablecloth they had found, and Grandpa had even taken the time to lay down a tarp. He was already hard at work again, digging with a precision and pace that was closer to cutting a drainage ditch or punching a time clock than digging a grave, and Hannah felt ashamed. "Here," she said, handing him the keys. He really had been a mean old dog, and mean dogs, biters, deserved to die. That was that. He pocketed the keys, wiped his brow, and started at it again. Each damp mound built steadily upward, one after the other, to his left. She fell to counting them. He was a block of a man, really. She knew he loved automobiles, his mustache, and keeping his hair tight and clean. Also, he believed in the freedom of taking your shirt off. His everyday shirt, a short-sleeved button-down, waved at her from the branch of a tree, the pear tree with the dead dog beside it. Preparing herself for the work, she shook her arms around, felt the sun in a long, dark braid on her back, and tried to tuck away that small feeling of guilt as she gathered up the plastic ends of the tarp in her hands and started pulling the weight of the body along the ground to the hole. It wasn't easy. She fell several times. The work of pulling herself up made more difficult with each successive attempt, and kept glancing at her grandfather, who chose not to acknowledge her. "You can give up, you know." She narrowed her eyes and rubbed her hands on her jeans, grabbed on again and heaved, barely budging the dog. "Never." She fell back on her butt. He snorted. "How about some water? I'm thirsty." Hannah threw down the corners of the tarp and ran to the truck. "Yes, sir." Swishing her braid back over her shoulder and out of the way, she scrambled over the edge, almost falling on top of the dog that was still alive, Holiday, her grandfather's dachshund. Snarling and swirling, he lunged up after her. She ran to the corner, picked up the water jug by the handle, 2 hands, and swung it at him. Stupid dog. Grandpa Jack continued at his work. "You leave him alone now." He anchored the shovel, wedged out a hunk of earth and grass to widen the hole. "How would you feel if you were sleeping and someone stepped on you?" Making slow turns in the nest of rope he was using as a bed, Holiday lowered his arthritic back and settled down. He kept an eye on her, his head resting on his paws, and she supposed this was a valid enough argument. "Sorry, Grandpa." "It's all right. Can't help it there's some of your mother in you." He looked up at the sun. "About 4 o'clock now, give or take." Resting the shovel down inside the hole, he walked the few steps required, accepted the water, and drank. Halfway through the jug, he wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and reached out to the braid that had snuck back out in front of her shoulder. He gave it a tug. "You really are starting to look like her, you know that?" Hannah felt herself blush, heat rushing over her body, knowing she'd seen him do that before. She wanted to think of something else, and thankfully, her grandfather returned to his shoveling, picked at the soil a few moments more before deciding that he was done, laying his instrument down and heading for the tarp. He let the dog slide into the hole. The weight of the thing, scraping the dirt, sounded like crunching over snow. The soft thud as it hit bottom reminded her of ice sliding from the roof and hitting the white-covered ground, muted. Hannah shuddered. Worthless. Should have just thrown the carcass in the woods and let it rot, her grandfather said. She swallowed. It had been her idea to bury him underneath the pears after Grandpa had decided to shoot him, and she had cried in the consideration of any alternative. He had been her dad's dog, Champ, if he had been anyone's. She picked up the trowel Grandpa had grabbed especially for her and started to cover the grave. A singular chunk of sod remained. Grandpa Jack, showing it wasn't worth his trouble to bend down, prodded the clump into place with the side of his boot and motioned for Hannah to press it into the earth. Just then, from the left, down the valley, the slow crunch of tires on gravel traveled down the lane. They were probably heading over the little bridge of the creek by now and winding up to the house. Don't you worry about your daddy, he said, yanking his shirt from the tree and pulling it on him. He'll be all fixed up this time around. He scooped her up and over his back, and she clung onto his neck, resting her head against his warm shoulder. You've been such a good helper these past few days. I think you deserve a present, don't you? He hoisted her up into the truck. She beamed, continued bouncing all the way across the bench, clipping her seatbelt, of course. By the time they had exited the avenue of fruit trees, had driven over the barren ruts of the garden and around the back of the house to the basketball court, she could hardly stand it. To her, even Holiday was amused, standing up on two legs in the back, pressing his nose against the rear glass, smiling at her with his watery eyes. Her grandfather rolled the truck around the shed that served as backdrop to the court, easing up inside her mother's brown sedan. Hannah couldn't help but notice the vacant dog box at the edge of their property line, the way the tattered square of carpet that served as door waved in and out like there was an animal taking in air inside, even though she knew that there wasn't. She had that feeling again, a sinking in, so she turned back and stuck her tongue out at Holiday and got out of that truck, joining up at her grandfather's side. Thanks for digging up my yard, Jack. Her mother sighed, pulling her long dark hair, already threaded with gray, straight up from her scalp and into a knot, and headed around toward the trunk of her car. She was followed close behind by Hannah Jean's little brother, Michael. Her mother pulled out a plastic garbage bag heavy with laundry and a suitcase. Her father still hadn't left the car, stayed in the passenger seat, staring straight out in front of him. Hannah Jean stopped circling her grandfather. Following the material of her shirt in her fist, she pulled it down, stretching it toward her knees. He didn't know. Even at the VA place with all the other veterans, he didn't know what had happened yet, what they'd done. She walked up to her father's window, gripped her grubby fingers underneath the weathered plastic molding, and leaned her forehead down against the glass. She breathed, let the dirt and oil saturate. Slowly, as if on a spit, his head turned. His eyes were rimmed, more yellow than red, and he had the deep circles again. But he didn't look at her, not really. Just leave him alone, let him settle in. Her mother closed the back hatch, let it down with a thud. He'll come out when he's good and ready to. She carried in her husband's things, held open the screen door of the house with a knee, and ushered in a little boy with a nudge of her head. She kept her focus straight throughout, determined on getting inside. Over her shoulder, she said, "Thanks for watching the house." Her grandfather lingered on the space where she had been and waved at it. He waited for the click shut of the screen before he went to the car door, opened it. "Welcome home." Her father just sat there. His back was straight, and he gripped onto his kneecaps, still staring. Hiding back a bit, Hannah Jean wondered if he already knew what they did. He could see the dog box clearly enough from there. Grandpa Jack cleared his throat, laid a grip on her father's shoulder and her father's side, as if the contact pulled the air right out of him. One leg was followed by another, and she noticed that his shoes were different, sneakers. His odor had changed too, had become obvious and metallic, bleached out, like the laundromat they had to go to when their machine broke down. Now standing, a half a head taller than her grandfather, even when slightly stooped, he offered his palm. Her grandfather leaned into him, pressed against his ear as if he were about to share a secret, but then thought better of it, giving him a few solid thuds on the back, embracing him in his way. "Welcome back." Easing off the son, Grandpa Jack motioned for Jeannie to come over. "Your turn now." Her father looked at her and smiled, his eyes still drooping and sad, and held out his hand as if to shake hers too. "Sorry, honey." She wanted to cry. There it was again, like back in the orchard, like in the truck, and she couldn't trust what might happen if she held on to that hand. It might send her down farther, deeper, instead of pulling her out. She nudged a pebble his way. It rolled over the others and kissed the front of his new secret. Grandpa Jack's mustache twitched, broom-like, back and forth across his face. How's that any way to act? She couldn't move forward, so she fled. She turned around, avoided his grasp, and bolted for the hillside behind the court and house, the woods. Get back down here, young lady. You owe this soldier an apology. She slid on a rock, grabbed to a root that poked out like an elbow, and pulled her weight upward. She passed the old tire swing, which she pretty much always avoided anymore since it was up here, and flung it behind her as if to obstruct whoever was not following behind. Didn't stop until she neared the campsite, her father's special place, almost but not quite to it, regretting heading in this direction, wondering why she was here at all, and too afraid to change to do anything about it. She settled in among some ferns, hugged her knees at her chest, and watched them below. She sniffled and rubbed her face. SarahB. Her father closed the car door. He was a little heavier than he'd been, but that wasn't saying much. And his beard, while still at his face, didn't scrabble all over weeds and vines, but lined his jaw, softened up the angles. It was easier to look at him now. Not like the last time, when he finally came down from the site after weeks, months, like a bear out of hibernation, like an avalanche, whacking at blackberry bushes and briars, machete swishing and slicing, sometimes at nothing but air. The dog box, abandoned with its vacant door, cracks of light showing through, filled her eye. That day, how her father had gone past, swinging hard, had made him come out, sent his boot into the side of the box again and again, and then how Champ hadn't even seemed to want to fight until her father had sent that boot into his ribs. After that strike, the way he had lunged up, all teeth, and landed them on his arm. The way her father had stood there, back straight, had just let him hold on. Now, the worn-out patch of earth where Champ had run forward and back each day, around toward the house, out away in the direction of her grandfather's, and then back to the woods, traced like an arc on her mind. She recalled the thump of his tail when he brought him food and water, how he was nice, even let you pet him, sometimes.